Hey there, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this special edition of Your Take. We're taking a look at your questions when it comes to this conflict in Ukraine that's taking place right now. So many people are worried, and so many people are wondering how we got here and what's next. Joining us now is a very special guest. I want to thank for joining us a very special guest, Dr. Jeffrey Treisman. He's the Assistant Professor of National Security of the Henry C. Lee College of Criminal Justice and Forensic Sciences. He's over at the University of New Haven. And he joins us now to talk a little bit about, first of all, how we got here. It seems as though, so many people were looking at mask mandates being pulled off. And the next thing you know, we were engaged, the world was in this conflict. And it happened quickly. But, Doctor, this has been a long time coming, right? Talk about how we got here.
I mean, arguably, you could say this has been decades in the making in many respects. You'd have to, in many respects, have to trace it back to the origins of NATO, the post-Cold War kind of strategic alignments as well. So in many respects, it's a long time coming. Putin himself has spoken about his concern about NATO's and its expansion towards Russia. But really, this is about the growth of Western powers, Western democracy as it spreads across Europe, stemming from the post-Cold War II environment to the Cold War environment and to essentially what we have now. But Putin has really made it no secret that he's feared expansion of NATO and feared expansion of Western powers and also this kind of ideological component as well in terms of concern about democracy. Putin obviously is an authoritarian leader, and he doesn't want to see democracy as an ideology spread so close to his border.
When you take a look at Ukraine and over the last, as you say, decades of this conflict brewing, we've seen that Ukraine is slowly kind of in its own sense, the people have wanted this kind of liberation. They've enjoyed this kind of a lifestyle. And that seems to be poking the bear in some way, huh?
Yeah, I think so. It's not uncommon and not certainly, they've had a number of revolutions over the past decades in terms of seeking independence, seeking democracy, seeking their own sovereignty. And a lot of the other former Soviet satellites as well, of course, have fought for their own independence. One in particular, I think that's quite interesting, of course, is Chechnya, as well as Georgia, which we saw another conflict with Russia in 2008. But, we see these conflicts in the Soviet satellites for a number of years, if not decades.
Okay, so we have some questions coming in right now, Doctor, from our Fox 2 YouTube viewers right now. One question that some people have is, so what's the point of Russia invading Ukraine? You mentioned the ideological differences they have with the rest of the world. But in this case, why Ukraine and why now?
Well, yeah, that's the big question. I think it's two different ways that we can approach it. It can be more complicated and that in terms of an explanation, but one is just simply growth of power. So if you think of it in very simple terms of East and West, which is obviously a very simplified version of the scenario, but if you think about East versus West, and the West has grown obviously in power, NATO has expanded in power, and Putin and Russia does not like that. And so an opportunity to strike and prevent the spread of Western power and Western influence is one way to do it. I think in terms of the individual, there's the role of Putin. Putin has made kind of a strategic calculation that now would be actually a good time to achieve his longstanding goal. He actually, when he was made prime minister and later president, he's made it very clear for decades that he does not like NATO expansion, as well as his advisors. But you can also look at Putin as a driver of what's happening and why now. But when we really pin down to why now, it's very clear that there's good reason, if you will, for Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. If you look at the United States, obviously deeply polarized. Putin is assuming that the political parties in the United States wouldn't marshal a very coherent and unified response. But not just in the United States, you look around the world. Poland, for example, is also, if not more so, deeply polarized than the United States. You have, of course, the Peace Party, the Law and Justice Party, and you have Donald Tusk, his Civic Coalition Party that's fiercely divided. in Poland. And then, of course, you have the European Union. It's had some of its internal struggles. You've got this new chancellor in Germany who's untested and has shown an affinity for more diplomatic resolution to conflict in Europe. So for a number of reasons, right, in terms of the political environment, Putin, rightly may have calculated that he could have gotten away with it. And there's also the historical component, right? Putin has waged a number of wars in former Soviet satellites and has succeeded. 2008 in Georgia, the Chechen Republic, 2 separate wars in Chechnya, the first Chechen War, the second Chechen War, and then obviously most recently in terms of Ukraine itself in 2014 and Crimea and the Donbass regions. He succeeded. He did fairly well in achieving his own individual goals. And so for all those different reasons combined, it's driving the conflict that we see today.
One of our viewers is asking the question, are we at risk? And I think when you this weekend heard Putin talk about, in a sense, more so than before, readying his nuclear arsenal or, being on alert, that was frightening to a lot of people. And if no one was paying attention before, they certainly were after hearing that. Some people are saying, what the heck here? What are we talking about, finishing up the ice cream in your freezer and saying goodbye? It's such an ominous thing to hear like that. How serious is this for the rest of the world right now?
Yeah, I share your viewers' concerns, and I will be a little bit more personal. My wife actually is from Poland, and speaking with our family members in Poland and European friends are very concerned about Putin's announcement. In terms of our viewers, I would not be too concerned at this point. We've been tracking in terms of national security. Putin has essentially said these sort of comments in the past about nuclear policy. And in fact, just a couple of years ago, he was overseeing various nuclear tests or preparedness exercises. Really, when it comes down to it, the term that he used on live television, transition to a special regime of combat duty, it's unclear what that even means. Our nuclear weapons, just as much as Russia's, are always on high alert. They're in fact pointed at one another right now, and they have been for decades throughout the Cold War. So for a lot of people who maybe were not alive during the Cold War or forgotten the Cold War, we're both targeting our nuclear weapons armed and ready to go. But we're unclear what it actually means. In all honesty, it probably just simply entails that crews are going to be more likely to conduct additional inspections of nuclear capabilities. They're going to verify communication channels. Maybe even soldiers have to cancel their leave. And perhaps even some intelligence services are going to be redirected to monitoring potential incoming nuclear attacks from the United States or the West, which obviously is not likely.
Yeah, that's a really good answer, and I think something that you said in terms of context. People who weren't around during the Cold War, they don't remember that. They don't remember that we've seen this movie before in a different way. But at the same time, we're looking at someone who is agitated. And I know, I talked to another expert who said you don't want to poke the bear, and this is a person now who has economic sanctions that are crippling the Russian economy. And many people are fearful that he'll go to a place of desperation and do things that are unreasonable. What do we know about Putin as a person and his temperament and the reliability on his mental state?
First and foremost, you have to assume, and we can make the assumption, that Putin is a rational individual, right? He's a rational leader, and he's demonstrated that. He understands the cost and benefits of his actions, the advantages and disadvantages of certain policies and initiatives, the invasion of Ukraine obviously being one of them. So he's what we call in international relations theory and policy circles a rational individual. Now, that isn't to suggest that when an individual is pushed into a corner, right, and in the midst of crisis, in the midst of the fog of war, that miscalculations can't be made. And that's the concern that we have now. The probability of a global nuclear war is very low. I want to assure your viewers of that. But however, we have these kind of issues in terms of why was Putin making this decision and proclamation? Again, it is a very unclear proclamation. We're not too sure what he actually means by the transition to a special regime of combat duty. My theory is that it's actually intended for domestic audience. In other words, this announcement that Putin made wasn't necessarily for the United States and not necessarily for the world, but actually for Russians. As we've all seen, that Russians now are protesting and fierce demonstration against Putin's policies. And I think Putin was unprepared for that. And in fact, the fact that it was televised, this announcement was televised, is unprecedented, because we know when Putin is going to elevate or prepare or make any sort of change to his nuclear capabilities. We've had 50 years of nearly Cold War and 75 years total of this kind of backdoor negotiation. We have communications, especially since the Cuban Missile Crisis, of being prepared of what our adversary is going to do, the Soviet Union and now Russia. And so televising this is a little unprecedented, and it leads me and others to think he's trying for a rally around the flag effect, to kind of galvanize his citizens that this is a serious conflict and we need your support. We're facing a potential of a nuclear conflict. The second reason I think Putin made the announcement, perhaps even on television again, is he wants to change the narrative. We've all seen that Putin has essentially been marginalizing the international community, and rightly so. He's violated international law. But he wants to change the narrative because the world has come around, rallied against Putin. We've seen a lot of the videos of the attacks on civilians, the humanitarian crisis that we're seeing unfold. Nearly 500,000, according to some estimates today, people fleeing Ukraine. And so I think Putin also wants to change the narrative that this is no longer the bad man Putin trying to violate international law and invading Ukraine, but instead this is a bigger issue of the East and the West and Cold War nuclear mentality. So I think that is, from my perspective, what Putin's motivation is.
Well, if you're just joining us, you're watching Dr. Jeffrey Treisen, who's joining us to talk a little bit about what's going on right now in Russia and, of course, in Ukraine mainly, and what the Russian leadership is doing. A lot of people are wondering, in terms of Ukraine, the attacks on Ukraine, many people thought they would be far more devastating by now, but it seems like the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian military has been able to hold off and stave off takeovers of an entire city. What does that look like for Putin? And that seems to be frustrating for them.
Right. And I think that goes back to his decision to kind of change the calculus, to perhaps dissuade NATO and the West and any of our allies from supporting the growing insurgency or the Ukrainian military and civilians that are fighting off this Russian attack. It is interesting in the sense that, Russia still hasn't controlled the airspace. The Ukrainian military and defenses are still launching drone attacks against Russian positions. I think you also have to consider the Russians themselves. Most of these troops that are actually going into Ukraine are very young, 19, 20 years old, and they think very fondly, actually, of Ukraine. My understanding is that a lot of the troops, Russian troops, especially those that have been stationed in neighboring countries, in Belarus, for example, were essentially lied to, that they were told that they're just going to conduct strategic exercises or military exercises. And the next thing you know, they're being deployed into an offensive invasion of Ukraine. So a lot of these soldiers we're starting to see are not only young, but unprepared and surprised and feel lied to in many respects about this invasion.
Let's talk about what happens next in terms of talks. Right now, we have a news alert saying the United Nations Security Council is holding a meeting to talk about this situation in Ukraine. How effective and what kind of binding power can come out of that? And also the talks between Russia and Ukraine. A lot of people say these are low-level Russian officials and diplomats that are having talks with Ukraine, and this is just mere symbolism. What do you make of talks both at the UN and also at the border?
Well, this is very complicated, and I think any scholar, policy expert is going to have a very different opinion in terms of the efficacy of international organizations, myself included. I am admittedly skeptical of the power of international organizations to have any sort of binding effect, as you suggested. But there are some very important benefits, especially when you're facing a potential for humanitarian violations, that it can rally the international community together to condemn gross violations. And we saw this over and over again throughout history in a variety of conflicts where essentially an autocratic leader has been marginalized. And so it's this combination of unifying effect and support, either in terms of delivery of aid and material aid, both lethal and non-lethal, sanctions, all these packages together can help unify the support for the Ukrainians. And that in and of itself is very important for Ukrainians to see the international community come together has inspired them. That in and of itself is very critical, especially if this conflict does, and I believe it will, transition into an insurgency. We need to help inspire the Ukrainian people to fight for their democracy and fight for their sovereignty. I think, though, in terms of the negotiations, was the second question, although perhaps these are kind of, the testing the waters, if you will. We're not expecting to see, Putin himself or the Ukrainian president sit down face to face. They're going to simply kind of send their intermediaries to negotiate perhaps some of the kind of marginal changes that could be made in terms of settling this particular crisis in this conflict. But I think it's very important, nevertheless, that we offer or engage in these negotiations and offer Putin essentially an out, if you will, an opportunity to extricate his forces from Russia, from Ukraine back into Russia. And this is something that's been discussed throughout history. In fact, The Art of War by Sun Tzu had famously wrote that you need to provide your enemy, quote unquote, a golden bridge to kind of leave the battlefield. You want them to escape. And so we have to be sensitive to that. But as right now, we're just kind of watching and waiting and seeing and hoping, really, myself included, that these negotiations become a little bit more productive and fruitful.
Yeah, so not just mere symbolism, but actually some binding, policy or something that comes out of this to help alleviate the situation. Adam has a question. We have time for only a couple more questions, so if you have one, ask one now, because Dr. Treisman has another appointment at 4:30. That gives us about 10 or 15 minutes left here, about 10 minutes. So why don't we look at this? Adam is saying, do you think Putin is surprised on how Ukraine has responded, and what his next move will be if he does or doesn't succeed? You've touched on a little bit of that, but in terms of what could be happening behind the curtain here. But how would you answer that? Do you think Putin is surprised on what he's been able to do in Ukraine?
Yeah, Adam, that's an excellent question, and that's a very important question. Yeah, absolutely, Adam. I do think Putin was very surprised, and in fact, that's part of the reason why I believe he made that announcement about his nuclear capabilities going on combat duty or combat ready. So yes, Putin is very surprised. I think he's also surprised by the Russian people as well and their forthright objection to their government's decision to invade Ukraine. And I think above all, he's very surprised by the resistance that his military has established or encountered in Ukraine. And there's a number of reasons for that. I think, Putin, for example, we know relies very heavily on consultation with his military advisors rather than his intelligence advisors, which kind of can cloud his judgment and perspective of what's happening on the ground. In terms of what we do, which I assume is what Adam is trying to get at and a number of your viewers, what does the United States or the Western community do in response, or what can we expect? First and foremost, with respect to Putin's pronouncement about his nukes, do nothing. Right. And I think the Biden and really the international community is correct. We've learned from 50 years of the Cold War the importance of de-escalation, not to escalate in kind or response. So doing nothing is very important. And that's very important, too, when you consider what I believe one of Putin's objectives is to change the international narrative that it's not the bad man Putin, but rather this global Cold War kind of conflict. If we ignore it or downplay it, that doesn't allow Putin to change the narrative. It doesn't distract from what's happening in Ukraine. Second, in terms of what to expect and the potential next stages of the conflict, I do think that Kyiv will ultimately fall. In terms of numerical superiority, obviously, Russia is far more capable in marshaling a larger force than the Ukrainians have at their disposal. So it's inevitable that I think Kyiv and many major cities, including Kharkiv, the largest city in Ukraine, are going to fall. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, you can make the argument, and I believe this is where the Ukrainians will really have an advantage if they're able to do so, is in terms of launching a sustained insurgency, right? So the further that Russian troops enter into Ukraine, the greater the strain on the logistical supply chains. You're going to have some severe issues in terms of fuel and supporting the troops. And then you're also going to put them really in harm's way at an insurgency, being able to strike at these different targets and move around. The concern that I have is that this conflict then at that stage turns into the second Chechen war, where essentially Grozny was absolutely leveled. And I believe the United Nations at the time declared that Grozny was the most bombarded and destroyed city since the Second World War. And so we have to be very concerned about that potential of Putin elevating the situation and committing a number of humanitarian atrocities, which we're seeing. We're starting to see reports today of cluster bombs being used. And so that's my concern, is the more that Putin escalates the human rights violations, the more it's going to create, one, a humanitarian disaster. But my research indicates that that's going to allow him more likely to win. I actually have a book that's coming out in July that talks about Russian policy, when bad states win, that the greater that Russian and other bad states use more forthright, destructive, indiscriminate attacks, the more likely they are to win. And that's a concern that I have, especially the news that we've seen coming out today.
And I had one follow-up question, then we'll get to our last question before we let you go here. And the follow-up is, you talked about, essentially not making this worse. And not escalating the situation. What about these sanctions? I mean, right now we know the ruble is almost worth nothing as of the last few hours. Isn't that escalating the situation in some way?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we have to respond in some kind, but when we talk about Cold War mentality and nuclear escalation, that's a different topic altogether. But it's an excellent question. There's different ways that we can essentially escalate, if you will, a conflict. There's different ways that we can target our adversary. But the Cold War notion of mutually assured destruction, that's what we're actually talking about, not escalating, is the threat of nuclear conflict. And that's very distinct policy and strategic concern than, of course, sanctions.
And the last question is it's a simplistic one, but one that certainly people have concerns about when they're not paying close attention, like you and like others, even in the media. They just say, can this lead to a third world war? And I know that, that just has such a charge to it when people mention that, but that's what people are asking and talking about. So many of the Facebook questions that I got have that question. I know there's not a simple answer to that, but what are your projections as you take a look at this conflict?
Low probability. A low probability. We've, of course, again, 75 years of, Soviet and Russian relations and nuclear missiles pointed at one another, ready to go. We've been able to avoid circumstances like this. And don't forget, we've been involved in a number of wars. For example, during the Cold War, proxy wars with the Soviet Union. We've engaged in conflicts around the world with potentially nuclear weapons pointed at one another. I think it's oversimplistic to suggest, and I see where people are coming from in terms of this is a global war. This is World War III. The probability is low. Of course, as a policy analyst and a scholar, I can't say zero, but
Sure.
I want to assure people not to worry. I think this is a manageable conflict, and that's part of the reason that I think if we start to see a shift, and I think we will, into an insurgency, it'll become what's referred to as a low intensity conflict, a whole nother phase of this war. That said, I think it's important for people to realize that insurgencies and low intensity conflicts, they can be equally devastating, especially in terms of humanitarian crises. And they can, of course, last decades. United States involvement in Afghanistan is case in point, 20 some years in the region. So we have to be attuned to the fact that there are still enormous costs that civilians in particular are going to have to pay if this does shift into that next phase.
Dr. Treisman, one last follow-up. You mentioned insurgency a few times. For those who aren't familiar with the difference, obviously, kind of define that for us in terms of what that looks like.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah,
No
absolutely.
worries.
So an insurgency is different than what's called a conventional war. So a conventional war is you see two clearly defined militaries combating one another with very clear front lines and battlefields. An insurgency, on the other hand, and there's different variations of how we define it, is there's no clear battlefield. And in fact, the insurgent, in this case would be the Ukrainians, are going to allow Russians to take over territory. They cede territory and conduct guerrilla strikes. So hit and run strikes, mobilization, quick in, out, no sustained battles, and no sustained conflicts. And the emphasis, of course, is on wearing down the enemy. So think about the United States and Vietnam, right? One of the famous cases that we've encountered. And it's not a decisive battle that ends the war, but it's slowly sapping and innervating and reducing the strength and the willpower of the enemy, in this case, Russia. I hope that was a decent explanation.
It was, trust me, as someone who spent many years in a political science classroom, I appreciate your lucid and clear explanation, and you did a great job explaining this stuff at sort of an elementary level for those who are just trying to get through their day and understand this in a quick half hour. So I just want to say thank you. You've been listening to Dr. Jeffrey Treisman, Assistant Professor of National Security of the Henry C. Lee College of Criminal Justice and Forensic Sciences over at the University of New Haven. Hey, I hope you'll do us this favor and come back for another half hour, maybe in a couple weeks, and revisit this with us.
It'd be my pleasure. Absolutely.
You did a great job, and thank you. I know you have other TV you got to get to, so we'll let you go, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks for your time.
All right. Take care. Thank you.
That's Dr. Treisman. We thank him so much for joining us today. I just want to mention that, we continue on the streaming channel here on the Fox 2 website. If you're watching us there, the Fox 2 YouTube channel, wherever you're watching this, our commitment is to make sure when there's a big story that we're where you are. And that sometimes is in front of a television. We know tonight at 5, we hope you'll be watching at 6, 10, and 11. But sometimes it's on your phone or on your iPad. We're here all the time, especially when a big story is happening, either here at home or across the borders internationally like this one. So we'll be here. We'll continue to, of course, watch this story very closely. Stay with fox2detroit.com for the latest on the conflict in Ukraine. And, of course, stay with us on television as well. We'll see you at 5 o'clock. In the meantime, have a great day. I'm going to go read my scripts for the 5. Take care.